country or a place where a different language is spoken. In India, you travel to different parts of the country. Every state there are different kinds of languages. Like in Nepal, the spoken languages, dialects are different. And because England had ruled us for a long time, English has become our language, way of communication. So whenever I travel to different parts of India and occasion arises to speak in a language of the state concerned, we have a problem. Of course, Hindi is spoken in a good part of northern India and some parts of southern India too. So we speak in Hindi. But today when I hear in a country which is long, unending saga of connection and relationship between India and Nepal, I wish I was obtained at least one day to learn a bit of Nepalese and to be familiar with you in greeting. I owe my apologies for not having been able to spend one day in this endeavor. This visit was arranged and organized in such great speed, and which I thought would have never happened, but for the very kind and organized invitation of your learned Attorney General, Dr. Dinwani. And I hope the occasions will arise sooner when I will carry your promise with me to be able to converse with you in Nepalese. And that will be a great pleasure, not for you but for me. And so having said that, yesterday I was asked to choose a subject of my interaction with you today. This subject just came to my mind. Sometimes it happens to every one of us. As lawyers, even writers, thinkers, ideas just float in your mind. They come from nowhere, and then you find that you become part of the idea. And before I go further, I have a very old connection in Dr. Yuvraj Chandrola, but we have a very long connection, and I have in my library one of his prized volumes on jurisprudence. And within a week after he gave it to me, I finished reading that book, and I keep recommending that book to a large number of academics in India, in a way of looking at issues other than Austin and Salmon and all that English writers. I'll come to it very soon. So why should we talk about rule of law and civilization? When the Western world began to talk about civilization, they were talking from a level of hierarchy, superior kingdoms and people based on race and knowledge and economic orders, and others who are primitive, not developed, not civilized, so on and so forth. So the entire European powers, whether it is England or France or Netherlands or Dutch or Spain, they try to conquer the rest of the world by physical conquer. It appeared they wanted to conquer areas and places for economic reasons. The idea of being a world empire for reasons which are peculiarly 16th and 17th century, namely economic expansion. If such economic expansion has not taken place from Europe, probably good part of our forest wealth, our natural resources would not have been plundered. So on the one hand, those European powers thought that they were bringing civilization to the rest of the world. Oh, how mistaken they are. Civilization was not a matter or a subject to be received from the rest of the world or Asia. Whether it's China or India or any part of Asia, ideas of being together as human beings in the midst of diversity of faith and religion, in the midst of diversity of thought and feelings, is something not strange to us. That's, I think, is the one great idea of civilization. But when the Western world thought civilization means economic development and living at a certain standard of life where hierarchies in the social order does not matter, if that's how they understood civilization, I think they were wrong. But then they were wrong in one sense, but they could not resist this imposition of idea of civilization and the hegemony and control of the European powers wanted to bring upon the rest of the world for a number of reasons. Those reasons can be counted, but before I do that, by reason of the European powers spreading all over the world, I find 2 or 3 consequences taken place. One, suppose, certainly an important idea. The others are very drastic in their consequence. The first is the idea of a constitution. For more than 200 to 300 years, Europe, Islam and Christianity fought with each other. The War of Crusades left a long line of bloodshed in Europe. Both religions wanted to conquer each other. And you have, notwithstanding the emergence of Protestantism, Calvinism, so on and so forth in Europe, these 2 religions fought against each other, bloodshed in Europe. And the idea of a constitution can be said to be incidentally a product of what happened in Europe. The warring empires and kings and religions and states. The English people say, very proudly, the Englishman is a king in his own castle, and go back to the days of Magna Carta. As if Magna Carta, in the absence of Magna Carta, probably the idea of liberty, etc., would have never gone. So even today, English judges talk very proudly about Magna Carta and its contributions to liberty and all the surrounding ideas relating to liberty, freedom of thought, expression, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and no taxation without representation. All of us know about the Boston Tea Party in USA. And so this idea of a constitution has grown slowly over a period of time in Europe. And what is the idea of a constitution? Is the idea of a constitution the same, received in the same way, practiced in the same extent and same manner in different parts of the world? And if it is not so, why? The one aspect of the matter probably all of us as lawyers would like to look into when we passionately argue some very important provisions of our current constitution, and we say that there is an engagement of citizen in a serious hostile situation with the state or fellow citizens. Is that social orders which are based on hierarchies, whether it's Hammurabi or to some extent even the laws of Manu. Go to any part of the Babylonian, Sumerian kingdoms. The social order was based on a hierarchy. The lower, the higher, So moving away from a hierarchical social order where all power, social power, private power, personal power, between men and women, and citizens, the human beings were centered not in an impartial position or a center of power, but in human beings with a discretion unbridled. Moving away from this hierarchical social order to a social order where all power, political, social, economic, and private power is now transformed into a social order of a different kind. And that is the idea of a constitution. Power moving away from people with endless discretion and moving into a situation where discretion is the last word on human life and state power. If I treat that as the idea of a constitution, well, I think globally, almost all parts of the world are tuned to the idea of constitution. What makes this marriage with the idea of constitution more elegant and beautiful is the emergence of the human rights dialogue post-World War II, the Universal Declaration of 1948, and all those covenants and conventions that have happened over a period of time. When you start reflecting on this movement of power from human beings with their unbridled discretion into institutions which are determined, regulated, supervised and monitored by rules and norms, what a beautiful thing that happened to human civilization. So this idea of a constitution is one aspect of the matter which has happened to common humanity both after the Second World War, and I'll probably say a few words about what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Before I come to that, if we have understood countries in Asia like India, Nepal, or even China to a large extent, Confucius, Lao Tzu, so those great thinkers in China or India, and the great literary contributions that India and Nepal have long held together, like Ramayana or Mahabharata, or any one of the other spiritual literatures, they all talked about only one important thing: sharing. You have a very interesting, beautiful piece in Rig Veda which talks about sharing. All of us are equal share. If you go back to 2000 years ago in the ancient Tamil literature, it talks about all the world is one, and sharing is the most profound thing that can happen to human beings. So sharing as the fundamental value of civilization. But how do you share? It is not possible because we entered into a division among ourselves. The Israeli historian Yuval Harari now talks about how agriculture was the reason why people got divided. Of course, Karl Marx himself talks about feudalism and the movement away from feudalism to capitalism and so on and so forth. Very interesting. But then, I think that was a very narrow view of Asian history. I always thought that, even as a student of Marxism, I always thought that Marx had a very narrow view of Asian history. And added to all that, you had thinkers like Max Muller coming and talking about racial division or Aryan invasion of India and all that kind of stuff. So the basic civilizational norms and parameters which influence our life in the Asian continent, namely sharing, if that value is not part of an idea of a constitution, then why do we need an idea of a constitution? So I'm looking at the idea of a constitution as a marriage between the value of sharing as most fundamental for all human beings, and once you want to share, then power becomes, immaterial. But if you don't want to share, power becomes material. So, moving away from ancient times, today we live in a very, very different world. Probably 100 years ago it looked very different. 10 years ago it looked very different. Probably yesterday it looked very different. And all of us are agents of this change. Sometimes we are masters of this change, sometimes we are victims of this change. But these changes have occurred, brought in and ushered in a large number of what one may call civilizational benefits, in the sense there is a technology benefit which unites us by being able to communicate, transact with each other. This technology benefit, I say, is also a matter of sharing. But for this technology benefit, our ability to share our thoughts and views and our resources probably would have been still under handicaps. So, the next aspect is the global economic social exchanges. And the global economic social exchanges are not taking place the way they're taking place today. We would have still been fighting colonial wars. European powers would have still talked about colonial physical occupation of the rest of the world. But today I don't think any country in any part of the world would even remotely dream about colonizing any other part of the world. The idea of colonialism is virtually, in the sense of physical occupation of any other part of the world, is dead and for good. I do not think in any future except when any cataclysmic thing happens, when somebody, a mad, authoritarian global leader takes over technology and right, things like that, I don't think in the future this world will be under any process or thought of colonial expansions. And that's another important, I call a civilizational contribution or the idea of a constitution. England probably can no longer talk about conquering any other part of the world, because when they went to India, went to Africa, at any other part of Asia, they carried with them the idea of rule of law. The rule of law in a very limited sense. The conflict between the king and the citizen is Magna Carta. But once they parted with the idea of a constitution and the rule by idea of a constitution, I don't think they no longer have the competence or to talk about in any sense about ruling others. So all the pickups which have happened in the past 100 years or so, so the birth of the idea of a constitution, the different dimensions of sharing of global resources, particularly technology and culture, religion and faith. So these two fundamental aspects which have changed our life altogether, I would probably call a civilizational compact, which before I try to expand a little further on this idea, historians normally tell, Western historians say, history began in Greece, and then Rome expanded, all those wonderful ideas of civilization, and from Rome it got transferred to Asia to the old Silk Route, all of us know the Silk Route, from China all the way to Rome, and then from there on, industrial revolution, and then economic expansion. We have Adam Smith talking about the wealth of nations, and all those 20th century economists in England, and then the US economists talking about how economic development is the only key to social, restructuring. We have a lot of questions there. Whether this talk about economic development the way the West has thought about, we have landed in serious questions about sustainable development. We don't talk about sustainable development. We talk about the fragile ecosystems which are exposed to the human uncontrolled, unconstrained human developmental thirst. And how did they all happen? If colonialism has not happened, if sharing as the most fundamental value would have been with us for long, perhaps these fragile challenges, ecosystem issues, etc., probably would not have occurred at all. So on the one hand, I said there is a benefit, the rule of law issue from colonial expansions and entering into an idea of a constitution. On the other hand, those unforeseen consequences even the European powers did not see. There are a lot of study and literature by which show about how European expansion has virtually killed and destroyed very precious, valuable natural resources not only in Asia but also in Europe. We also know about what the Americans did in the early part of their conquering the continent of America, virtually eliminating all Native Americans. Unfortunately, you have on the one hand the colonial power, the idea of a constitution, a rule of law, but they go about virtually destroying the rest of the world. In one sense, there's something very seriously wrong about this. How do we really analyze it? These are very important questions. But when Western jurists and writers talk about rule of law, they talk about the most narrow aspects of rule of law. They talk about a constitution, they talk about independence of judiciary, they talk about separation of powers, and they talk about all those nice things which may happen under good governance. You will have Ford Foundation or UNDP or any other US agencies which have toolkits on rule of law. And if you're not familiar with them, then I think they say that you are not a rule of law country. Look at Afghanistan, which has been virtually battered between the battle within Russia and US. So I think there's something fundamentally wrong with the Western world refuses to acknowledge the inherent conflicts which they have brought in between the idea of a constitution and the rule of law on the one hand, and the social reordering and sharing on the other hand. I'll briefly get into, I know when you begin to talk about Marxism, there are some issues. There are all kinds of schools of thoughts, people who look at it in controversial ways. I don't propose to get involved in that kind of a dialogue. But one important idea which Marx thought was shared, because I think when I talk about Marx, I'm not talking as a political person. I'm talking as a person concerned with rule of law and the constitution and all that. He said in the Communist Manifesto, philosophers have only hitherto interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. The changing, who will change the world? So by changing the world, which is unequal, well, we will move towards an equal world. But who is going for the agent of change? So somebody will have to be the agent of change. So a revolution will be the agent of change. And you now see what kind of revolutions in different parts of the world have they really become agents of change, namely the fundamental moral values which all of us carry with each other, namely sharing, empathy, altruism, compassion. Those fundamental values need not be taught to us by any person except by community, family, and all those social coalitions which are part of our, Asian, what we call religion and spiritual framework. So who is going to be the agent of change? Today, constitution is an agent of change. So even in the rest of the world where experiments and socialist experiments have been undertaken, we are slowly moving towards an idea of a constitution as a tool of change. But for me personally, as a lawyer, as a human being, I think if somebody comes and tells me, you must abide by somebody else other than you, who will think for you, and they will tell you who can be the best agent of social changes and social order, I may have difficulties with that. All of us are equally endowed with the capacity to think equally, and then think equally about not only about ourselves, but about everybody else. And I think that's a greater civilizational value which Asia has contributed to the rest of the world. So if this is the position, why would I like to look at somebody telling me that I'm going to be your agent of change? Serious problems there. But that problem is not mainly with his ideology. So within democracy there are challenges. Democracy is not free from challenges. The very idea of democracy as a process of constitutional development, and the constitution, the tool of democracy, there are challenges. Why? So some people may say fall back on ideology is because of an unequal social order. We are not equally endowed. So the spread of economical wealth and resources and use and so on and so forth must be brought, subject to radical changes, and only constitutions can go about it. So then you ask a question again, those who work under a constitution or a democratic constitution, are they angelic? Each one of us who become public servants, are we so angelic that we are so detached in our life that we no attachment to any faith or religion, that we can become pure, disembodied human beings that they always think about the good of others? I think we have serious questions there. So when democracy means periodic representative politics, and a political party becoming again the agent or a tool of change, not much of a difference between an extreme ideology and the political parties who are considered to be agents of change. All these problems. On one hand, while we have all these problems, we are safe because I said we are wedded to the idea of a constitution where we will no longer go back on our solemn assurance of saying that power will no longer be vested with a few oligarchy or a few set of people or a few institutions. So we moved away from that. We will no longer go back to that. If that great movement is a part of, I call a civilizational compact in a different sense. I will certainly can talk about the civilizational compact from spiritual and religious points of view, but that again will be only one part of the story. While we all of us would like to talk gloriously about our past heritages, but some lines to be drawn, past heritages perhaps cannot breathe fresh life in the future vision except when you look at the fundamental values which past heritages continue to give to us and transmit to us. That's why if you look at the treasures and wealth of our literature of Asia, whether it's religion or spiritual or other even literature, I'll just give you an example of how the fundamental values of governance was so highly treasured. We have like the Ramayana and Mahabharata in both Sanskrit and Hindi. In the southern parts of India, we have very acclaimed literature, literary pieces. Buddhism and Jainism was also practiced in southern parts of India, and they continue to practice there. In what are the well-known epics, there's a lot of stories, like Ramayana and Mahabharata, a lot of stories. Many of our, literature pieces carry a lot of stories. The story is about a king. The king goes in the evening to light a lamp in the temple lamp would not burn. So he asks his minister, Mr. Minister, why is that the temple lamp is not burning? Is it because I have done something wrong unconsciously, unknowingly? Have I done something wrong like that? A king asking a question like that means the highest level, even unknowingly if I have done something wrong, the world suffers. The highest value for a king is that the king will not even do unknowingly a wrong. So today we have a problem in democracy where many of us in positions of power or authority do not ask this question. Should I not stop from doing anything even wrong unknowingly? And that's the highest value of dharma, as we call it. And that permeated the whole system of governance in Asia for a long time. So this is a very important value that every one of us individuals or being part of a community or a clan or a family or a group will keep telling ourselves that even unknowingly I will do no wrong, which will cause a harm or injury to all who are around me. What a great value it is. And that, as I said, is starting. So let's gather all these thoughts together and to find out how democracy, idea of a constitution, our great heritages, which are given to us, civilizational values of antiquity and perhaps which cannot be buried forever. And at the same time, contemporary contributions of ideologies which keep reminding us that you must be under God. So ideologies are not bad, but ideologies are not with themselves an end towards transforming the world. So we are in this very wonderful movement and transition to a different global compact where these two fundamental values, namely sharing and this value I talked about, not doing something wrong even unknowingly. If these two values begin to permeate our everyday life, I don't think that we need a parliament to enact very complex set of legislations. So we have parliament engaging on this complex legislation only because these two civilizational values are not practiced the way we ought to be practicing them. So I, as a professional and as a human being, would like to weave all these ideas together and say, and that, in my understanding, is the idea of a constitution, is the idea of a rule of law, and ultimately I would probably say rule of law is a non-violent revolution. If rule of law is a non-violent revolution, we don't need a violent revolution in any part of the globe. So we had this experiment. A non-violent revolution through rule of law can achieve much more and keep intact all those civilizational values which humanity has gathered over long periods of time. So I would probably say I am wedded to rule of law as a non-violent revolution, and the rule of law is part of a civilizational compact where all glorious contributions made by each and every civilization across the globe for over several thousands of years must now come together as a compact. Not necessarily through coercion, not necessarily through colonialism, but again by sharing. I think it can happen. We made to happen only because if all of us say, I am committed to that. A solemn vow to say that we are all committed to that. So I am here as an ambassador from India to say that we need to have such solemn commitments as human beings of a great, Asian continent. So let me thank each and every one of you for being with me today afternoon. I know I could spend a little more time with you, a few more engagements in the afternoon with the Attorney General. And I'm sure I will do for more and more occasions like this and more engaged deliberations and so on. I thank each and every one of you for being here today afternoon and my best wishes to each and every one of you, great and glorious life.